Hello and welcome. I'm Steve Clements, editor-at-large of The Hill. We're delighted to have you joining us for our second session of our conference, The Future of Human Connectivity. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Facebook, Nokia, and Qualcomm, for their support of today's program. For the next hour, we're going to look at what the future holds for smart cities and 5G technology, paying close attention to how we ensure this technology bridges the rural-urban divide and gets to those in underprivileged urban areas as well. Before we get underway, a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us, and I hope you do, at #TheHillConnects. We are broadcasting live and we'll be taking your questions throughout the program. And if you experience any trouble with the live stream, just click refresh and it'll all go away, or it'll get better. Our first guest of the hour is Daphne Koller. She is the CEO and founder of the company Incitro, which is aiming to transform drug delivery by combining machine learning with biology. She's also the co-founder of Coursera, and in 2012 was one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people. Welcome, Daphne. Great to be with you here today. You also worked at Calico, which is another, one time, Calico, which has been an alphabet company. I think that its raison d'etre is really to sort of end death. You work at all the cool companies, including the one you're at now. And so you're, I think, right at the nexus of some of the things we've been talking today, which is machine learning, AI, how technology is going to come together at this point and just create new platforms and opportunities that we can't even imagine today. So why are you doing what you're doing, and what can you see with the rest of us want to have a peek at?
Well, I think we really are at a moment of unusual change in terms of the availability of technologies that are coming together from a whole slew of different areas and allowing us to do things that we would never have imagined. Specifically, what I'm doing right now is what I believe is part of the beginning of a new era, which I think of as digital biology. Over the last 20 or 30 years, we've seen two parallel threads that have emerged, one on the life sciences in the increasing availability of tools that allow us to measure biology at unprecedented fidelity and scale, and also manipulate biology using very precise tools. And what we have on the other side is the ability to now interpret the amount of data that we're getting from these different measurements and really come up with a closed loop, if you will, where we measure biology, interpret what we see, and then go back and write biology to do things that it would never otherwise have done.
We have a lot of lay people watching today's show. What sorts of problems does machine learning in the digital biology space help us to deal with?
It helps us do multiple things from, for instance, designing new proteins. There's been a tremendous amount of progress on that, from measuring cells and really looking at the cellular level at what a healthy cell looks like versus a sick cell, and then identifying interventions that revert the unhealthy to a healthy status. And then in terms of our ability to measure human genetics, for instance, and understand the causal factors, in many cases in hundreds of genes that come together to produce complex diseases like Alzheimer's or autism or diabetes or cardiovascular disease. And I think we're now finally starting to understand the causes of some of these complex diseases, as well as being able to identify interventions that potentially revert those.
One of the privileges I have in this job is I get to interview lots of fascinating people. I've interviewed Dr. Fauci several times. I've interviewed, top scientists in the medical and health space. And one of the consistent themes that runs through, particularly with viruses like we're facing today in today's pandemic, is that many people saw this coming. Just the uniformity of agreement that America underprepared, the world underprepared. They did some things, but we need to sort of take a platform approach. And so in your world, in a way, you're kind of talking about platform methodologies, that can be used and applied across a set of things. Is that a leap in itself to be thinking that way, or am I just behind the times?
No, I think you're not behind the times. I think there have been a few platforms in the biology space, but it's certainly not been the traditional way of thinking about things. A lot of traditional biology is very much hypothesis driven, where a brilliant scientist comes up with a thread, with the end of the thread, a new insight, and then follows that to come up with a new discovery, which is awesome. But the sort of engineering mindset of a repeatable process that one can then just turn the crank and new outcomes emerge from that, that is a relatively new approach, and it occurs now at multiple different places. It occurs in new therapeutic modalities where some of the more recent entrants into the space, and this is more of a 20-year thing, but where there's been this ability to sort of think about how do you turn the crank to come up with new medicines, for instance, whether it's new proteins or new other types of therapeutic modalities. And then I think the other place where we start to see platforms is in some of, for instance, the work on human genetics to try and uncover the causal basis of disease. And there's now tools that start from sequencing of the human genome and then multiple computational tools for interpreting those sequences to really get at the underlying causal mechanisms here. So those are all platforms that when you start to string them together can become increasingly powerful.
Let me ask you a question that maybe it's a science fiction type question, but are there things that we should be worried about that we're not seeing? I mean, I recently had the CEO of CRISPR on a show we did here at The Hill. Fascinating conversation, and we talked a little bit about the norms and the habits and science and how it proceeds, but not everyone plays by those rules, and we've seen, no matter where you were on the question of COVID and the SARS-CoV-2 virus, a zoonotic. Everyone agrees. A lot of people agree it's a zoonotic virus, but some people are beginning to say maybe this is the kind of thing that could be manufactured and created. From your perspective of being deep down in the arena of technology and machine learning, what keeps you up at night? What do you worry about?
So I think there's two different ways of thinking about this risk. One is the way in which evil people might end up using technologies that could be used and are being used for good, but having those people use them in ways that are really detrimental to society. And the creation of viruses is one such example that we're very familiar with already on the computational side. I mean, there's been some very nasty computer viruses out there that have done tremendous amount of damage, and it's a constant arms race between the people trying to create computer viruses and the people who are trying to defend against them. So that's one angle. The other one, which I think is honestly equally risky in some ways, is the fact that we're building increasingly complex systems that we just genuinely don't understand. And sometimes these systems have unexpected behaviors, feedback loops that sort of cause escalating behaviors that could potentially lead to things like crashes of entire economies, which is kind of the precursor. What we saw in 2008, 2009 was in some ways a precursor to that, in that we built an economic system whose consequences we didn't fully understand. And as we start to build increasingly complex systems, like for electric grids and others that rely on technology that is really quite complex, that can cause failure modes that we would not have previously predicted.
Daphne, in your arena, I mean, I'm fascinated by not only your current company and what you're trying to do with machine learning, but your path and at Coursera, at Calico, and I've been recently talked to another female head of research and development yesterday of Inovio, and so we're beginning to see here and there more leading women scientists. But I just want to ask you about this inclusion question, because you are. And I, in my world, remain one of the most influential people in the world. But what does that world look like? Is it inclusive? Do you find changes happening? You're in the high-tech arena. Is this still a white male-dominated scene, or are you beginning to see progress?
I think both are true. There is progress, but it's still very much a white male dominated field. And while there are obviously the cases that we all hear about, the really egregious Me Too cases, which are, as they should be, front and center in people's minds. But what I think people don't talk about nearly as much, but is very pernicious, is the much more subtle forms of discrimination, where you walk into a conversation with as part of a group with, and the people on the other side assume that because you're a woman, you're the whatever, you're the administrative assistant, you're not the CEO, and that happens to me quite often, and I think it's part of the thing that makes it challenging for women to really advance in the world if everyone assumes that they are that they're not the important person in the room. And I think it's a really challenging mindset, because how do you, as a woman, it's hard to find a way to respond that isn't problematic. You can just let it go and just have that impression persist. Or the other option is say, wait a minute, but I was the one who came up with this idea. And then, of course, you're treated as being overly aggressive and seeking credit. And so there's kind of like a no-win situation. Letting it go is not great, and speaking up for yourself is not great either. So one thing that I always suggest when I'm asked this question at various panels is that it's up to the people around you to notice when situations like this happen, and speak up. Speak up for women, speak up for people of color, and say, wait a minute, it wasn't your idea, John. It was Mary's idea, or it was the idea of Jose, or whoever it was who came up that got ignored the first time they came up with this idea.
I really appreciate your candor on that. It's something I think is important to highlight and to raise, because I've heard things very much, and so I appreciate you sharing that experience. Let me ask you to not put on your Coursera hat, but your experience with online education and changing it, because part of this new world we're talking about, and I guess there's always a tension between, do you design something for the smartest kids in the room, or do you design something to kind of bring everyone along? And we're basically about to make a technological strategic leap. And I guess my question is, for people who are going to get jobs in this area, people who are going to have literacy in this area, how do you bring on, there's no school, 4-year college, liberal arts degree that's necessarily ready for the world we're stepping into. So I'm just interested in your insights in how we train and prepare a society that doesn't have literacy in what we're creating. I don't have literacy in it. I'm trying to, but sign me up for a Coursera class.
I think before we even get to Coursera classes, there is a tremendous inequality of just access to basic technologies, and the ability of people who don't come from privileged backgrounds to have access to internet, to have access to basic devices. I mean, yes, it is true that most people have a mobile phone and even a smartphone, but that's a very limited tool if what you're looking to do is have a meaningful educational experience. You can't really type on it very effectively. You can't do homework assignments. So how do you get people to have access to even just the core capabilities that would give equality in terms of opportunities for education? And I think that's, again, it's exacerbated by the fact that a lot of those people are first generation educated, and so their parents are unable to help them or unable to provide them support. So we know how much how important it is for parents to be there and support their children. That was true even when we were just talking about reading and writing, but now that we're talking about access to technology, I think it's even more important. And when the parents don't have those skills, it's much harder for the kids to be technology savvy and really engage in this digital world that provides some of the rest of us amazing opportunities, but they're kind of shut out.
I also want to ask you about the health of the science ecosystem in the country. And you've worked at a lot of private firms in this, but all of the firms that I think, have relationships with universities, some of those have relationship funding universities with things like the National Science Foundation or the NIH. And I guess one of the shockers that I learned recently is, became aware of just how paltry the science investment, say, in the National Science Foundation is. NSF is not NIH, but National Science Foundation has an $8 billion budget, and I met the former director who was then fighting to get her budget from about $7.5 billion to $8 billion. We're talking $1 billion, which may sound big, but it's pathetically small when you look at that as the national investment in the science partnerships in the nation. So I'm editorializing, I'm allowed to do that. But what do you think? You're a scientist, you're in this world, does this suck?
It sucks incredibly badly. It sucks on a couple different dimensions. So not only is there limited financial support for science, there's also a surprising amount of disrespect for basic scientific findings. And I think we've seen that in, frankly, the response to the coronavirus pandemic, where basic scientific observations about, say, the importance of wearing masks are ignored, and there's science behind this, and people have done incredibly rigorous studies to understand the value, for instance, of wearing masks, and there's groups of people who just ignore and dismiss that science, and that causes tremendous harm, because with the proliferation of different news outlets that we have around us, and the difficulty in knowing what is true news and what is fake news, it becomes easy for people to dismiss rigorous science in favor of a fake science, and cause tremendous harm to individual people, and especially in the context of an infectious disease like COVID-19, to the people around them. So I think the funding situation is one serious issue, and just the lack of respect for scientists and the rigor of the scientific method is, I think, an equally or even larger problem. One of the things that I hope might happen as a very thin silver lining out of this coronavirus pandemic is if we are in fact able as a society to create a vaccine in 12 to 18 months and really help us emerge from this mess, then maybe people will realize that the only way we were able to get there is by decades of investment in the basic scientific foundations that made this possible. And maybe that will increase the willingness of society to pay a little bit more to the NIH budget and the NSF budget, so that we're able, next time some really bad thing happens, whether it's another pandemic or, frankly, the crisis of climate change that is rapidly looming, and we've kind of lost sight of that because of COVID-19 and the fact that it's consuming all of our attention cycles. But that's not gone away. And when we get there, we're going to need some really rigorous, valuable science to help us get out of that mess. And so hopefully, maybe as a consequence of this crisis, people will realize that science and investment in science is absolutely critical.
Well, Daphne, you put a really important question. My colleague and friend, our editor-in-chief, Bob Cusack of The Hill, is here with us in the studio and listening. And I think it'd be a fascinating editorial subject once we get past this virus, once there is a vaccine. Science has hopefully saved us. And then the editorial question is, will anyone remember that? I think that's a fundamental issue. So Daphne Koller, CEO and founder of InCitro, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you'll come back. Great conversation.
Thank you so much.